everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson. Hope everybody's doing okay. All the pollen in the air has started to get to my voice, as you can maybe tell. I mowed the lawn over the weekend, and my throat has been scratchy ever since. Hopefully that adds some fun drama to my voice and doesn't just sound like I'm a congested mess. Anyway, hope everyone's having a good week. We have a great show for you this week. Nat Cassidy is here to talk about his new book, When the Wolf Comes Home, and to talk about a short story that I had never heard of from a book that I had never heard of that is out of print. So Nat had to scan it into a PDF and send it to me. It's a story called The Burr Woman. It's a cryptid story. It's really creepy, and it leads to a really fun discussion about childhood fears and the way we evolve as horror fans and monsters in general. It's a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy it. Before we get to that, though, I did want to recommend a movie called Borderline that just came out. It's available to rent on VOD if you want to throw a few bucks their way. It is written and directed by Jimmy Warden. It is starring Samara Weaving, who I will watch in just about anything, and an actor called Ray Nicholson. It is a stalker comedy thriller with horror elements, and she plays a pop star, and he plays an obsessed fan who infiltrates her mansion because he thinks that they're destined to be married. It sounds creepy. It is creepy. It is also absolutely hilarious. Features probably my favorite needle drop of the year. It's going to be hard to top. I will not spoil what the song is, but it's amazing. It's just a really good time, and it's also like the best comedies that center on this kind of stuff, a rather incisive satire of the way we tend to look at stuff like this. I really loved it. It's called Borderline. You should watch it. But for now, you should keep listening to the show because we're going to head over to our interview with the wonderful Nat Cassidy. Joining us this week for The Scares That Shaped Us is a friend of the show who hasn't even been on the show yet. You will know him from novels like Mary, An Awakening of Terror, Nestlings, the novella Rest Stop, and coming April 22nd, When the Wolf Comes Home. Nat Cassidy, welcome to the show.
Hello, I'm glad to finally be here. I hope to one day be one of your repeat guests. I'm a big fan. First time caller, long time listener.
I appreciate it, man. Like I said before we started the call, like you were when I talked about starting this thing, you were one of the authors. It was kind of the contingent of you, Clay McLeod Chapman, and Rachel Harrison, who were all like, "Yeah, we'll be on your podcast. Go for it." And now we've completed the trifecta. Clay's been on, Rachel's been on, and now we have you.
So this is the final episode, right?
Yeah, we're done.
Shutting it
well,
down.
no, I can't because I promised Clay that we would do the final episode from his deathbed. That would be the final episode of, because when he was here at Christmas, I said, he was like, "Am I the first repeat guest?" And I said, "Yeah, and you're the first guest and the first repeat guest, and if you want, you can be the last guest." And he said, "Well, we'll wait until I'm dying, and then we'll do
it."
So
yeah, it'll be like the movie Martyrs. Like you'll find out what happens after death while interviewing Clay.
Exactly, and then I'll end my own stuff exactly like Martyrs. Which, spoiler alert for people who haven't seen
really
Martyrs.
Happy, positive.
It's
what the French are known for in their
such a bright light in the world. Martyrs. Anyway.
We're not here to talk about it.
We're not here to talk about Martyrs. I'm sure we'll do the Martyrs episode eventually. We're going to talk about an obscure short story that you brought us. But first, I want to talk a little bit about When the Wolf Comes Home. This is a werewolf novel, a novel about childhood fears, a novel about family trauma. It is so many things. For our listeners, could you give us a little taste of what When the Wolf Comes Home is?
I can certainly try. Let's see. This is early in the promo blitz, so I don't have like my pitch down yet. So let's see what happens. It is about a struggling late 20s, early 30s actress in LA named Jess and she's going through a really rough spot in her life. Her career has not turned out the way she wanted it to. She's working this horrible job at this nasty 24-hour diner under a highway. And to make things even more complicated, she's just found out that her estranged dad, who she hasn't seen or spoken to in 20 years, has been found dead. And she's just got all these, like, really complicated, existential, very grown-up things going on, and she's trying to process them. And she has a particularly awful, nightmarish shift at the diner one night, and she comes home kind of in a daze, trying to figure out what to do, what this all means for her very rutted life. And she hears a rustling in the bushes outside of her apartment, and she goes to investigate, and she finds this terrified 5-year-old boy who's hiding there, who's clearly on the run. And she takes him inside, cleans him up a little, tries to find out what's going on and if she can help, kind of grateful for the distraction. But before she can really do anything, the kid's dad shows up, demanding that she give him back. And the next thing she knows, the situation erupts into horrifying violence with a huge body count, and she and the boy wind up on the run with the kid's dad, who is this monstrous shapeshifter pursuing them and wreaking havoc as he tries to track them down. That's like the first half of the book, and then the situation changes slightly. But that's all I'm going to describe, because that's all you need to know. Yeah, so it's kind of an homage to chase novels. It's kind of my love letter to like 80s era horror action. But ultimately, as you've just so aptly described, it becomes an examination of fear and fathers and the difference between adult anxiety and childhood fear, the externality of how children look at threats, and the internality with which adults kind of view the things that terrify them. Yeah, it's got a bunch of garish, ghoulish surprises in store for the reader, and I hope you pre-order it and then succeed on your pre-order and read it.
It has so much going on in it, but I was looking forward to it because I love Mary and I love nestlings, and so I was in for this from the beginning. But I knew that I was going to have a good time when I opened. Well, I didn't open because it was an ebook, but I turned the page over to the part 1 heading title, and the part 1 of this novel is titled "All Dads Are Motherfuckers," which is a great joke, and B, just a sort of mission statement for like, okay, I'm in the bag. I know what we're doing. What was your kind of way into this? Did it start with the kind of like all dads are motherfuckers kind of aesthetic, or did it start with I want to write a werewolf novel? How do I figure this out?
It was even more convoluted than that, if you can believe it, because I, and people who have read Mary might find this somewhat interesting, because in Mary I mentioned how I first wrote a version of that book when I was like 13. This, or a very nascent version of this book, was the book that I started writing after that, after I wrote Mary in quotation marks at 13. So this was the sort of like general dynamics of this story have been bopping around since like 1994 or something like that. It was different. Like the elements that make When the Wolf Comes Home what it is weren't quite there. Like the shape-shifting element, the wolf element, that wasn't in this early embryonic version. It was just about a little boy on the run from a terrifying father, and the little boy winds up on the run with this like slacker who rescues him. So that was just like the skeleton was there, and I never finished that attempt. So the book never really found itself the way Mary did. But that like skeleton has been around for a long time. And then when I kind of decided to revisit it, I had known, excuse me, I had known after Nestlings, which was very set bound, Nestlings, and Rest Stop as well, which was kind of written in the interim. Those were very set bound. They took place in like a single location, and they were all about like claustrophobia and stuff like that. So I wanted to write something that was the opposite. I wanted to write something that was propulsive and actually like traversed a map. I wanted a chase kind of narrative. And I was like, oh, I should revisit that old fragment that had like intrigued me, many, many years ago. And so I took this out and I was like, this would actually be a great opportunity to kind of unpack a werewolf story. I've always loved werewolves. That's always been like a sort of back pocket favorite monster of mine. And yet, like, there are so few werewolf novels. It's a kind of very challenging subgenre to crack. And to find like a new angle on. So I was like, that could be interesting because like it's about a scary dad and it's about a kid's fear of the dad figure. And fathers are kind of like mercurial and archetypal, and there might be something that's sort of like fairy tale ish about it. And that began to like coalesce with the idea of like, oh, and it could also be, it's this little boy and it's this like person who's like on the verge of like full adulthood, no going back adulthood. And so like that could be like an examination of the differences between fear and fear response to these two protagonists. They could say something about each other and teach each other kind of how to cope in a way. And so it kind of proceeded from there. It was not too far from the deep dive of It that I did on Talking Scared with Neil McRobert and Ali Malinenko. So I was also just kind of thinking of fear with a capital F too, and just kind of that. I'm always obsessed with fear. Fear is something that I think about all the time. It is my stock and trade, as it were, in this industry. It's the thing that we all kind of are confronting or analyzing or manipulating or investigating or begging will come to us for inspiration or effect. So fear is like always a thing I want to wrestle with anyway. But this seemed like it was a good opportunity to tell a story that kind of pulls at the roots of fear, kind of looks at fear as a character in and of itself and the facets of fear. And for me personally, also like allowed me to unpack my own feelings about fathers, and I got to borrow some of my wife's experience with her father as well. And I also go into this in the afterword a little bit, that it's about sort of like wild spate of anxiety that I had in especially in my like early 20s and mid 20s. So like it gets to unpack some of that stuff as well, just kind of the nature of one's like limbic response to threat and that fight or flight instinct that gets hardwired in us from time immemorial, from the primal soup. So just again, like I'm making it sound like it's a very like heady sort of slog to get through these like really heavy concepts and stuff like that. But I knew that the chase narrative and the kind of propulsive like 80s splashy set pieces and stuff like that would be the perfect opportunity to play with these ideas.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you about next, because yeah, you are dealing with these very interesting dynamics in terms of how these two people who are sort of forced to survive together deal with fear response. And it's a very interesting novel that way. And it gets more interesting when some stuff happens with your creature that I will not spoil in this interview because people need to go read the book. But on top of all that, like interesting conceptual thematic stuff, like it moves like a rocket. It has there's a set piece very early on involving an apartment building that I won't talk too much about because it is so fun to read, but it is, like you said, the body count is high. It is a brutal book. It is a creature feature piece of fun. And this is something I've sort of, one of the things that I really liked about Mary when I first read it was how well you deal with, you dish out these big horror moments early in your books. And just when the reader starts to feel like they can see the strings and sort of see the threads and where is this going, you sort of swerve. And with Mary, it was sort of a like, oh, she has this weird gift and all these strange things are happening to her. But actually, this is like way in her past, and this is tied to a weird sort of religious commune that existed out in the desert that she never knew about. And I was just like, whoa, there's like 2 books. It's like 2 books, and there's so much happening in this. Is that something that I've never talked to you about craft and how you write? So I'm wondering, with when you start your books with these big, like, all right, you want horror, you got it. I'm going to throw something amazing and outrageous and violent at you. And then we're going to go off to this other place. Is that something that you plot out? Is that something that you just sort of let yourself find? How do you do it?
It's usually, I mean, I am a plotter. I will like outline and stuff like that. And my outlines tend to be loose. So like I there's always the great debate of who's a pantser and who's a plotter. And one of the reasons I don't quite buy into that as a binary is just that, like, I'm a combo of both. I like to know where I'm going, then I like to know where I can deviate and like find places where the plan isn't actually working, and now we need a new plan. And like that's the fun thing, is to respond to your work as you're writing it and zig and zag and stuff like that. So yeah, it in some ways I do find that when I am writing, and especially when I'm like devising how a thing is going to work, I'm usually split into like 2 hemispheres, and one is that traditional one that you're kind of describing of, like, the cold horror novel's got to start with blood. It's got to start with a set piece and stuff like that. And then there's the other part that's like a little more iconoclastic and is like, okay, now you've set a pattern, and there is nothing satisfying about repeating a pattern too many times. So now it's time to like find the unexpected place that this can go, so that it doesn't just become a rote exercise in just kind of like fulfilling what the reader thinks is going to happen, and to try and keep the reader like just a little off balance, never trying to make it an antagonistic relationship with the reader or to try and make it unsatisfying or anything like that. But it's just like there's always a very insistent and persistent voice in my head that hates anything that feels just like a little too predictable or a little too of a pattern. And weirdly, I think Wolf is actually one of the times where I kind of tried to shut that voice up a little bit, and I tried to be like, no, this is going to be a chase novel. Like, this needs to have a structure that is kind of predictable in its way. Like, the reader needs to kind of know what ride they're getting into. And then the fun of this particular one was like, okay, well then the nature of the chase is going to have to change then. Like, I've mentioned this before, and it's very apropos to the whole point of this podcast, where although this never scared me as a kid, but a movie that shaped me as a kid hugely was Terminator 2. I was obsessed with Terminator 2 when I was a kid, and I specifically like borrowed that structure for this book because I think Terminator 2 is one of those weird examples, and Cameron does this a lot, where like it is a movie that is at once structurally perfect and yet the structure is imperfect. Like, it's just like this weird thing that he's able to pull off, or at least like at the height of his powers he was able to pull off, where, like, if someone wants to be really pedantic, they could probably break the movie into like a 5-act structure, but in your typical 3-act structure, that act 2 of Terminator 2 is like 75% of the movie, and it goes into an entirely different direction. Like, the movie then becomes about like, yeah, we got to escape the T-1000 and all that stuff, but actually, let's now go find Miles Dyson and try and stop the future from even happening in the first place. And it becomes this entirely different plot for a little while, and then in this like great narrative coup, Act 3 rolls around, and it's like, hey, the T-1000's still out there, and he's going to find you even if you think you have this little side quest. So like, I knew I was going to borrow that skeleton, basically. And so that for this particular case let me shut that voice up a little bit and be like, no, this can just be a chase narrative.
It's really interesting that you mentioned Terminator 2 and James Cameron, because reading When the Wolf Comes Home, I drew my brain went to Aliens and to the relationship between Ripley and Newt in Aliens, and it has that. I mean, Terminator 2 has it too. That sort of like, we are two people whose worldviews are informed by entirely different influences and ways of living. Like this little boy and Jess have whole conversations where it's just like, oh, you and I basically didn't live on the same planet until we met each other. So that's really interesting. But you also mentioned, because we're talking about chase movies and chase stories and road stories, I wanted to ask, before we get to our topic, what are some of your favorite like horror road movies? I know you've mentioned before, and I mean, we can talk about werewolf movies too, because I did a thing about underrated werewolf movies a while back for the AV Club, and you were like, oh yeah, a lot of these informed When the Wolf Comes Home. So like, what were some of the other influences that you were drawing from for this?
Let's see. I have mentioned in other interviews, so I'm just going to blast through these and then give you some new ones. But I've mentioned like Stephen King's Rose Matter was a big one. Dean Koontz's Intensity was a big one. And if you say Intensity, then that also means the French movie High Tension, because that movie just stole the plot of Intensity. Basically whole cloth. And I've also mentioned, and I mentioned this in the afterword a little bit, that the TV promo for a show called American Gothic in the mid-90s, it had like this 30-second ad that was really terrifying about this little boy in peril and this like father figure coming to get him. And that was a huge influence on, like, you know, the early baby Nat version of attempting to write this book. So those influences were very formative. Also Firestarter, obviously. Firestarter and Rosemary are like the two big like Stephen King DNA dumps into this. Beyond that, I'll answer kind of twofold. My favorite horror road movie is The Hitcher.
Oh hell yeah.
Fucking love that movie. And what I love about that movie, we'll get into when we get to the story at hand that we're here to talk about today, because it's a very similar itch that it scratches for me that I love so much, which is just like, why is this happening horror? You know, like, where that is actually the point. It's not like, oh, this is an element of the plot that is never answered and it's unsatisfying because of that. It's like the protagonists are literally saying like, why the fuck is this happening to me? Like, what is going on? I just like picked a guy up who was hitchhiking and now like that's the rest of my life. Yeah. There's something about that is so, I find so satisfying and like so getting to the root of the point of horror as a genre in the first place, to just kind of like unpack the tenuousness with which we live out this existence that we didn't ask for and yet we know has to end at some point. So like I think The Hitcher is just like, and also like I grew up in the desert, and so like I'm really used to that vista, that look of like just like a strip of road going into like mountains and a sky that is just heavy with ominous clouds, but no rain is coming. Like there's just something about that image that also just like, that brings me right back to the first moments when I realized I could die as a child. Like, it's just something like so primal and elemental to it. But the flip side of it, the non-road trip side of it, is that one of the other things that I really wanted to capture with this story, and one of the many reasons why I'm like so excited to talk to you on this show, because this book is like about these sort of moments, is that there were a spate of movies growing up in the 80s and 90s. There was just like this irresponsible track of people making movies that were marketed for kids, and then they just like just randomly cram like 5 minutes of the scariest fucking thing anybody has ever seen in their lives, and then just move on with the movie. And it was just like, here, there's not even like a narrative way to like predict that a scare is coming, like there would be now in a movie that's made now. Like it would usually be like heavily foreshadowed or something like that, and the kid would be like, oh, I don't like it, I'm feeling tense. We didn't get that. We just had like, bam, horror, and then like move on. It was like, oh my god, I'm fucking terrified. And the movies that I'm particularly meaning in this dynamic were Superman 3, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Jaws 3, and then other ones like, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which I know is a fundamental scar for a lot of people. And the original Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Like they all just had these moments of just sheer, uncanny, unvarnished, ungentle, like adult level effective horror. Like Superman 3 still fucks me up to this day. And it just comes out of nowhere. Like it's a dumb movie about Richard Pryor is like a hacker, and like Superman like being less satisfied with being Superman, and then suddenly in the end, like this poor woman gets sucked into a machine and turns into this like unheimlich like robot monster with like no life behind her eyes, and it's just terrifying. And like I wanted to find a story that could sort of lean into those moments, lean into what it's like to look at the world as a kid, and to have horror just like sideline you out of nowhere, and you have no defense for it at all. So it was like those sort of movies and those sort of feelings, like Large Marge and Pee-wee's Big Adventure, sent me running out of the room screaming as a kid. I've never had that reaction before or since. And I watched a lot of horror as a kid, but that was not supposed to be a horror movie. And I had to leave the room. And like to this day can remember that surge of just primal terror to get out of the room when that face changed. So that was the literal experience of those movies was a big inspiration to this story as well.
This is fun to talk about for me because, as listeners know, longtime listeners know, I was not allowed to watch horror as a kid. So my experience with horror as a child largely came from moments like that. Yeah. Moments where something scary was either shoehorned or just sort of emerged from a movie that we were watching that was not supposed to be horror. Yeah. And I as you were talking about that feeling, like one that I remember very specifically was Star Trek: The Motion Picture, when there is a transporter malfunction very early in the movie. Like in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, like they're meeting the new Enterprise. They've just rebuilt the Enterprise, and it's grand and beautiful, and they're about to go on the maiden voyage, and they basically get on the Enterprise, and within like 5 minutes, there's a transporter accident where people essentially they die because they sort of get stuck in between, and basically it sort of rips their bodies apart. And you don't see that, but you do see these people sort of halfway in through the transporter, and they start screaming, and then they just blip out, and and someone says, "Oh, we'll have to send a crew to recover the bodies." And seeing those people like scream in the middle of it freaked me the fuck out. Yeah. And my dad, who was the one who was always like, "Hey, you're not supposed to, you don't need the horror stuff. You don't need the scary stuff," had completely forgotten about this and was just like, "Oh, okay. Matthew, don't watch this part. Don't watch this part." And then like Indiana Jones, which a lot of people have those moments with Indiana Jones. But the other one was the James Bond movie Live and Let Die, which I went through a phase when I was like third or fourth grade where because they would show all the Bond movies on like TBS, and I became obsessed with them because like they're action movies about a guy who always wins and gets the girl. And so like, nine, 10-year-old me was like, hell yeah, let's watch these. So I'm watching all these Bond movies, and we get to Live and Let Die, and Live and Let Die has the sort of blaxploitation edge to it, and it ends with these sort of voodoo ritual type hijinks by the villains. And there's a bit where they open up a coffin, and the coffin is just full of snakes. And the idea is they're going to throw James Bond in this coffin full of snakes. But of course, he gets the jump on him and knocks one of the villains into the coffin full of snakes. And the guy lands in the coffin, and the snakes are biting him. And he just sort of makes these like choking death noises as he sort of bounces his body up and down from the snakes biting him. And then he dies. And that absolutely terrified me. Like, I was really scared of snakes as a kid, just because my dad was always warning, because I grew up in the country. So my dad was always warning me like, hey, there are snakes out there, be careful. Never had like a genuinely scary encounter with a snake. And it's not really a fear I have now, but seeing that when I was like 10 and going, holy shit, people put snakes in coffins. What on earth is happening? So those are the little trickles of horror. And like, I was just talking today on Blue Sky about the episode of Gilligan's Island with the giant spider. That was also like a weird, like, it wasn't scary, but I was like, you can just drop this in the middle of a sitcom. Like, this is wild. So I think that's a good segue into what we're talking about today. So on this show, I think so far our episodes are sort of divided into two categories. And one is the essentials, like people come and talk about the horror stories that are big and well known, and everyone is aware of them, even if they haven't experienced them. And then there are the ones where someone says, hey, here's this weird thing that I remember from my youth that probably no one else remembers. And you fit into that category. And I was so excited, because I love it when someone brings something to me that I've never even heard of. So since I had not heard of this before you brought it to me, could you sort of introduce our listeners to what story we're talking about today?
Totally. And like, I will admit that is one of the great joys of listening to this show too, is when it is a thing you have never heard of before. Like, your episode with Grady was a great example of that, where I was just like, oh my God, now I need to like find this thing that fucked Grady Hendrix up. Like, I could have, and I told you this in the email, that like I could have brought in Superman 3 or Jaws 3D, or like, one of the moments that I've already mentioned, or I was tempted to bring up Man-Eater by Hall & Oates, because that song fucked me up as a kid. Like, I had to stop listening to the radio because of that song.
Wow.
But instead, I decided to go obscure, as you said. And this is my actual copy of this book from, I think it's from like 1986 or something like that. It still has my initials in it that my mom wrote, because I used to take it everywhere I went. So the book is called Monsters You've Never Heard Of, by a guy named Raymond Van Over. But what it is basically like a little digest of monsters, of like cryptozoological stories. Van Over, who I'm still not even sure is a real guy or not. I think he is. But he kind of presents himself as an anthropologist and a collector of myth and stuff like that. And so it's just like a bunch of, it's like 10 to 15 stories of different cultures, really obscure monsters. And he tells these stories as a narrative. He tells them as like a fake little short story, fiction, not fake, but a fictional little short story. And they're all ostensibly based on real things. Like there's, let's look at the table of contents real fast. There's things like the Golem and the Wendigo, and then there are things you've never heard of, like the Monster of Croglin Grange and the Green-Haired Giant of China, that are all, purportedly cultural myths of wherever they are from. But then there's one story in here called The Burr Woman, and it is one of the most fucked up, terrifying short stories to this day that I have like I reread it in preparation of this because like I haven't read the Burr Woman in a long time and I should probably like know what it actually says. And even as an adult who does this professionally now, I'm like, this is a fucking scary story. Like this is legitimately unsettling and upsetting. It is purportedly it is an indigenous American myth. One of the reasons why I loved that story in particular, not just because it is, as we'll discuss, unshakable on a number of levels, but it takes place in the desert. It takes place in the American Southwest. So it was one of the few times like I got to read a story that was set where I was living and where I was growing up. I was so used to, for the entirety of my childhood as a Stephen King freak, I was so used to horror being like a New England thing. It had to be in Maine. It had to be like, you know, somewhere over there with the woods and the sea and like cold and snow. It was so rare to read something that was like, oh, this is my outside. This is my backyard. This is cacti and dirt and mountains and things like that. So this story takes place in New Mexico, but it could just as easily be in Arizona. And I'm forgetting, even though I just reread it this morning, I'm forgetting if it like actually like has a date to it, but it feels like it's like 19th century it's happening.
Yeah, it's like wagons and horses stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Wild West.
Yeah.
We're in the Wild West. I mean, the story itself is relatively thin, which is part of what makes it so elemental and terrifying. But it's about this asshole of a guy who's like a real taskmaster, and he runs a ranch, and he's known as like this really fastidious, cruel taskmaster of a guy named Tobias, and the other like quote unquote protagonist of the story is the kid who works at his ranch named Tom. And Tom, can't do as much hard labor as the other people who work there. So sometimes Tom gets to go with Tobias to the marketplace, and they're on like their little horse and buggy, whatever, wagon to the marketplace one day. And Tobias is yelling at him like, you loaded it wrong and things are going to fall off of the cart. So like stop the horse and fix the packages and stuff like that. And so Tom stops the horse. They're in the middle of the desert, and he goes to fix the packages. And meanwhile, Tobias goes finds some shade, and he's sitting there fanning himself, and he's barking orders and stuff like that. And then Tom notices in the distance this thing running between the cacti, and it's very small and it's very fast. It's uncannily fast. And again, I don't know who Raymond Van Over is or his background, but he sketches it with such well done economy that you can just see this uncanny shape moving, and he realizes that it's a human form. It's a humanoid form, but it's like loping on its hands like a chimp would. And before Tom can even call out or prevent anything from happening, this creature jumps onto Tobias, the asshole's back. And Tobias goes face first into the dirt, and the dirt's in his mouth, and he's screaming in agony. And this powerful man is just like reduced to this sobbing, vulnerable like victim, all in an instant, like a bolt out of nowhere. And Tom realizes that this thing that has attacked his boss is this tiny woman, this gray-skinned, bedraggled. She's wearing clothes, but the clothes are very ratty and tatty, and her hair is in her face. And she's this ageless woman who has come out of nowhere and has now sunk her fingers and toes into this man's flesh and is just like a living hump on his back. No motive, no reason, no moment of escape or even like chase. It's just bam, the guy is down. And Tom manages to like get him and his new living hump into the wagon and ride him back to his ranch. And they get a doctor to look at him, and the doctor's like, I can't fucking do a thing with it. Like, her fingers and toes are so deep in his skin that I can't tell where one ends and the other begins. And if we remove her, you might die. Meanwhile, the guy's like begging, kill her, cut her off of me, like do something. He's screaming and crying, and he's so pathetic, and he can't do anything. But everyone is like, there's nothing that can be done. Like if there is a direct analog I can think of to even what this is closely like, it's the like that early chunk in Alien where the facehugger is on.
Yeah.
The first time. It's kind of like that, but it's so much worse because this guy has a face and he can scream and he can beg for help. And some of the other ranch hands kind of start talking, and this is one of the many elements about it that like made this feel at once so perfect for me at that age, and also like that make it so terrifying. Is, so this is a New Mexican ranch, so there are some workers who are from Mexico, there are some who are indigenous, but they're like, oh, that's a Burr Woman. And like cross-culturally, they're like, yeah, we have those in Mexico too. And like, yeah, so it's just like this natural phenomenon of this thing that exists in the desert, and it's like, yeah, you got a Burr Woman. And the death sentence is basically just handed down, and then weeks go by, and this guy just has to live with this sentient tumor on his back. And the story describes how people like just start kind of avoiding him and not wanting to have anything to do with him and give him a wide berth because it's, he's just like the embodiment of wasting away. And to just make it even worse, the Burr Woman is heard whispering to him and telling him things like, sweetheart, I want a glass of water, or darling, let's go over there. And it becomes like this almost like parasitic, romantic sort of relationship. And Tobias is like getting more and more like almost zombified and like an automaton, and he's just kind of like going through the motions of being alive, but he's so clearly in agony, and he so clearly wants this to just end. And the story starts to wrap up when one morning Tom goes to like bring him breakfast, and Tobias is awake, but the Burr Woman is asleep. And Tobias says, like, I only get like a few minutes of the day before she wakes up, and I can't even move. As soon as I move, she's going to wake up and take over. Please kill me. Please. I can't live like this anymore. Please kill me. And then the woman wakes up, and Tobias is quiet. But that's like our first glimpse of like, oh my God, like this is absolute torture for this guy. And then to just make it even fucking more unshakably terrifying, pun very much intended, the story ends with kind of where it begins. Like they're back on the wagon. Tom is taking Tobias, I forget if it's to market or something like that, but they're like running an errand. He's still got his Burr Woman on him. And he's basically just, he's barely there. But suddenly it's like Tobias wakes up and realizes where he is. And even though it's clearly causing him unbearable agony, he jumps off the wagon and he runs to a cliff, and he throws himself off the cliff with the Burr Woman on him. And he plummets to his death. And Tom quickly, runs to the edge to see what happens. And he sees the broken dead body of his poor, tortured employer. And then he watches in horror, dozens of feet below, as the Burr Woman detaches herself from him and then looks up and sees Tom and says, I want it to be you, Tom. Wait for me. And then Tom runs for the wagon as he sees this creature start scrambling up the side of the cliff. And he gets on the wagon and he starts, whipping the horses, and he's booking it, trying to get as far away as he can. And the last moment of the story is he looks behind him, and she is running full speed towards the wagon. And you get the impression that she's going to catch up in no time. And at the very least, like she's going to be pursuing him. And what I just gotta shout out Raymond Van Over, because the ending is so well written. Then she began to lope after him, running like a chimp chasing a banana. Not the best analogy, but fine, we'll give him that. Oh my God, Tom said aloud, she's coming after me. And she was. Period. End of story. Get on with your life, child. It is so fucking brutal and terrifying.
It's an amazing story, and just reading it last night before bed, I was just kind of... You mentioned the economy of it, and this is something... You mentioned Grady's episode. This is something we talked about with that story, The Man Who Sold Rope to the Knolls. It is very much written And I'm gonna like go try to find. I'm gonna be searching for this book at every used bookstore I walk into from now on, because I want to read the rest of the stories. Because it is all about telling you. You get the feeling that this guy could go on for 50 pages explaining everything about this creature. But the way that it is structured, you only get certain little details of how she works and what she's doing. And the one that stuck with me, I mean, two things that really, pun intended, got under my skin. One is the way that she latches onto him and the way that they describe the way that works. Because you can picture like a little tiny humanoid latched onto someone's back. And they mention like her toes digging in where his ribs are, and her fingers on his shoulders. And the doctor is like, I can't figure out how to get her off because I don't know where her fingers end and his flesh begins. But he doesn't say that like there are holes in the guy's body. It almost sounds like she has merged their two skins into one. Like there's a new like thread of skin attaching her fingers to his body. It is written in such an unnerving way. It's like a Cronenberg thing. Like you could imagine Cronenberg having something like this somewhere, and it's like they're one flesh, and that is so creepy. And then they talk about the various, like at one point they just try pulling her off. They're just like, let's just get our hands under her and yank her off, and they can't do it because one guy says like you have to pull slowly because if you pull fast, it seems like she digs in deeper.
Yeah.
So that was one thing. The other thing was the blending here of the terrifying and the mundane, because like you said, it is written in such, it's like, you know, you see a Western or you read a Western story, and like if a guy gets gut shot and the doctor can only do so much, so the guy just sort of has to lay in bed and everyone's just going to kind of wait and see if he lives or dies. It's that, but with a monster. It's very like after a while, everyone's just like, well, Tobias is still laid up with that thing on his back, and we don't really know what's going to happen. But I don't know, you know, cows got to get fed, chores got to get done. I guess we're just going to live our lives while this. And the way that the ranch hands talk about it, they're just like, yeah, Burr Woman. Yeah, we know we know that story. Yeah. It's a thing. It's really scary and weird, but you know, a lot of weird things in the world. What are you going to do? It's so freaky to think about, just imagining, you know, because I grew up on a cattle ranch in Central Texas. So I wasn't in the desert, but I had that same sort of country life. And it's so freaky to imagine like your grandfather or someone like that getting laid up with a creature on his back, and everyone says, well, we can't do anything, and life just goes on, and it's so unsettling.
Yeah, there are two things just to jump off of that that made this so effective for me. I think that to steal your apt phrase, that really got under my skin. One of which is, I'm sure this, you know, we grew up in different environments, but I'm sure it's similar in this respect, where like when you grow up in the desert as a kid, you are, which is a great time to grow up when you're a kid. Very, very aptly phrased. But when you grow up in that environment, you are constantly, and it, you know, maybe it's different now, but like in the 80s and 90s, when you were allowed to just like roam ferally, you would just like get lists of, watch out for this thing, watch out for that thing, watch out for this thing, this plant will kill you. Here's where rattlesnakes, here's where scorpions live, here's where brown recluses live, here's where black widows live. Like, avoid all of these things, and you start to kind of, in your young and kind of, you know, still very plastic brain, you start to just sort of assume, or at least I did as a neurotic kid, that there are harms out there at every corner. Like there's something in this environment that will kill you anywhere you go, and there's no rhyme or reason. And especially in an environment like the desert, like it's myriad, like it's again all the poisonous things, all the sharp things, all the here's what you'll break your ankle on. Watch out for javelinas. Watch out for mountain lions. Watch out for snakes. Watch out for coyotes. Like it was just like such a deadly environment. And so this introduction of this new thing that was then in this story kind of treated with this almost blasé sort of like, oh, that's a Burr woman. Like you're gonna get a Burr woman occasionally. Like it just like added this feeling that like, I knew what it was like to look into the desert, to look into like what's between the cacti, and like something catches your eye and you don't know what. Like something is moving around out there. I knew that feeling very well, and this captures that so perfectly, of just like yet another thing in this world that can sideswipe you and just take over your life. But like the additional element of it that makes it, this will make the conversation maybe a little heavier. But like, so I was raised by a single mom, and she had MS. And at the time when I was a kid, like when I was first reading the story, her MS wasn't quite so bad. But like my earliest memories are of her being taken away in an ambulance. And like we knew that, even though it was relatively relapse remitting at the time, like it was a progressive disease no matter what. The exact type that she had was going to mean her eventual decline sooner or later. And she would have moments of like really severe impairment. And I've talked about this before, that like that was kind of where our shared love of horror and genre in general came in our household. Like my mom was a huge horror fan and a huge genre fan. And I think in part that was to like help her and to help me and my brother process this very complicated and very upsetting dynamic that we were going to have to live in. But this story captures that feeling in a way that like I've never really encountered in another story, because that probably any other story would try and actually like explicitly be about that thing, be about what it's like to waste away from a disease, or like to get a diagnosis that is completely intractable and mortal. This just kind of presents it in a very superficial way, and it's all the more effective because of it, where it's just like, no, sometimes you just get a thing and it's gonna kill you. And like this Burr woman diagnosis is no different than like someone in a doctor's office being told they've got like stage 4 cancer. Like it's just kind of like that feeling of like, there's nothing we can do, and here you go back out and live the rest of your days. It like captures that feeling almost too effectively, or like it was almost too effective for my little mind at the time, because it like there was something about it that just like immediately made me think of that fear. I don't want that to happen to me, and like I'm watching that happen to the person I love the most, and like that weird like sort of dual loyalty of like self-preservation and wanting to help. And like I understand the kid Tom in this story so well, and that feeling of like wanting to run away from a thing that feels like it might be inevitable at the end of the story.
Well, and that brings it back to anyone who's ever lived with a loved one who has any kind of chronic condition, whether it is just an annoying thing that they have to live with, or it's a progressive thing that they might eventually die from. There is this very odd emotional dance you have to do where we had a family friend die at a very young age of brain cancer not too long ago. And it's one of those things where you have to treat it with the gravity that it needs, right? You have to understand like, oh, this is a very serious thing happening to someone I care about. And at the same time, those sort of things can last for so long that it becomes something to laugh at, something to joke about, something to just sort of deal with as it comes in these very, like your brain wraps around it and adjusts to it in a really interesting way. And like you said, this story deals with that, but it never like, I feel like if someone were if the Burr Woman were a movie now, someone would like do that trauma horror thing of like the Burr Woman is a metaphor for chronic illness. And here is how we're going to directly make it a metaphor for chronic illness. And we're going to drill it into your head that that's what this is.
Yeah.
But as this story exists, it is such a fascinating mirror that you get to hold up to whatever's going on with you. And it's very clear, like the connections that you made to it as a young person. And like, I make to it now, like, but I have to lighten a little bit. I have to lighten the conversation a little bit, because while you were talking about all those things, learning all those things that can kill you as a kid, like I was reminded of a story, and I don't think I've ever told this story on the podcast before, but it's an amazing, like, I was not allowed stuff in the horror genre, but I was very much in that world of, I grew up in the country in the middle of nowhere. Like the nearest actual hospital, like a serious hospital was 30 miles away, something like that. So like it was a, so like I was always being told like, yeah, don't go like digging through stuff in the garage, because there's spiders in there and they're poisonous and they could bite you and you get sick.
Yeah.
Watch out for copperheads, watch out for water moccasins, watch out. My grandfather was convinced we had a mountain lion living in the woods. I never saw evidence of this, but he was always convinced we had feral hogs were a thing, and you had to be aware of like, if a feral hog comes after you, climb a tree, all this other stuff. So we were always being told these things, and it was very funny because that was just practical stuff. But then I had an older cousin who liked to mess with me, and one day we were swimming in my grandparents' above ground pool, and I saw for the first time one of those little sort of helicopter water bugs, which I had never seen before, and I had no idea what it was. I was maybe like 6 or 7, and I went over to it and I was like, that's a neat looking bug, I wonder. And I just sort of put my finger out, and I didn't know that they could bite or sting, and it stung me and it hurt. And I was kind of freaked out because I didn't know what it was. And I made the mistake of telling my cousin, like, oh, that bug just bit me. And he said, you know what bug that is, don't you? And I said, no, what is it? And he said, that's a venomous water bug, but it has a special kind of poison. It's a poison that will kill you in exactly 1 year.
What a monster.
Diabolical, right?
Oh my God.
And I, like, of course, I went home and told my parents this and was like, hey, Chase said that this'll kill me. And they were like, no, Matthew, no, that's not anything. Don't worry about it. You're fine. And like, they looked at my hand, and like I had a little red spot where I was bitten, but like there was no swelling or necrotic tissue or anything. So like they were like, you're fine. You got bit by a bug. You've been bitten by ants and wasps and stuff before. You're fine. But for the next year of my life, it was always just, it would always sort of creep back up in my head just a little bit. Just like, I wonder, what if he knew something that my parents didn't know? That doesn't seem likely, but what if he did? What if it is like some secret bug that's going to kill me in a year? And then one day I realized that like more than a year had gone by and I was fine. But yeah, it's a really interesting piece of growing up that, stuff can kill you in the city too, sure. But like there is something really fun about sort of living out in the wilds, as it were, that really sort of charges you for horror and that way of like mythologizing your own landscape. Mm-hmm. That I think is really fun, and that I think that you get into in Wolf, especially because you have this child character who, when we first meet him, he discovers a book of fairy tales, and he starts sort of tying those things into his life in some really interesting ways. Like, so when you carried this book around with you as a kid, were you like looking for evidence of these creatures out in the world? Was that, were you very aware that it was fiction, or were you like, I wonder if there's a Burr Woman behind that saguaro? What was it like?
I think I took it pretty literally. I think to this day, I still probably take it a little literally. Yeah, because I'm a very rational person. You know, I believe in science and I believe in the observable universe, but there will never not be a part of me that's like, but we don't know everything. Like, there's some shit out there, and I think it was books like this that, again, Nature or Nurture, like fed that feeling, fed that, because this wasn't the only kind of book like this that that I was a big fan of. There were also books about like famous hauntings was another favorite book of mine, and I'll never forget there was one of the stories in it was about the Bell Witch, and there was an image of a man, like I guess it was the Bell family. I'm forgetting the family that was like tormented by the Bell Witch, and it was this grown man cowering in terror in like a fetal position on the bed, as the covers were being pulled off of him by a hand that was coming out from the bottom of the bed. And there was just something about that was like, you know, again, especially as a kid, you look at like the grown man as like the archetype, especially as like a kid who identified as male. Like, you look at grown men as like the apotheosis of strength and of like having their shit together, and like that's what I'm gonna be one day. And so like these depictions in the Burr Woman or in this picture of the Bell Witch of men terrified to the point of like crying, like something about that like really got to me, and was like, oh my god, like this is really serious if it's like making this farmer like weep in terror. So yeah, like there were several books like that you know, I kind of touched base on them in Mary too, with all the like unexplained time life books that I also had like a bunch of growing up.
Yeah,
I loved that stuff, and I to this day, even though I have the rational tools to like explain away certain phenomena, I am at once constitutionally unable and also kind of unwilling to give up that little bit of you know, maybe there are Burr women. Like maybe they're just, you know, because the desert is being shrunk. Like maybe they're just harder to find, but they're still out there.
yeah, I do this too. I'm very into, like, I love cryptids just in general. Yeah. I love the idea of cryptids, and I love the idea of ghosts. And I've never had any kind of experience like that myself, where I could definitively say like that was a weird, spooky thing that I can't explain. Yeah. But I'm always open to it. I'm always like hoping that I'll get some sort of clue of like, whoa, that could have been a Bigfoot. You know, it's a very fun way of looking at the world, I think, and it also acknowledges a certain amount of mystery that I think is helpful for the trade that we operate in. Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about like the way that kids look at fear and the way that kids look at horror. Do you see yourself as ever writing like a horror novel for younger readers? Is that something that you're interested in?
That's a great question. I don't know. I haven't like fully entertained it yet. And it's funny because the book I'm currently writing is about a bunch of 10-year-olds. Like I'm writing my homage to like Kids on Bikes sort of subgenre next, but it's set in present day because I wanted to investigate if a Kids on Bikes supernatural story is even like possible to tell these days. So I've been like, you know, reconsuming things like Boy's Life and other stories like that to kind of you know, again, deviate from the patterns as I am sometimes precociously want to do. So like I've been thinking about that dynamic and you know, even down to when I was pitching this book, I made sure to specify in the pitch that like I know this is a story about kids, but this will be like an adult story. This will be for adults. Like this is not going to be a YA sort of situation. But like that then got me thinking like, but would I ever do that? I don't know. It's not the most interesting answer because I don't have a like definitive yes or no. But like I do know that this book stands testament to it. The Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which I know you should have another episode about shortly if it hasn't already aired with Erica, right?
Yeah.
Very exciting. Those were also very foundational for me too. More the illustrations than the stories themselves, but there were a few stories that stuck with me. But also, like, there's middle grade fiction to this date, like Ali Malinenko is writing great stuff. Laura Senf. There are a bunch. Stephanie Willing. Like, there are a bunch of really great middle grade writers who are writing things that like are just as effective emotionally and or frighteningly as adult fiction. So like, it's not like writing for a younger audience would be stepping down in like any sort of like impact sort of way. I think my main concern is I don't know if I could not curse. Like, that's my biggest crutch. Like, that would be my biggest challenge, I think, is to just not curse a lot, which I tend to do. So maybe one day, if I can rein the creative curse words in a little bit.
So before we let you go, you mentioned early on in this chat the It deep dive that you did with Ali and Neil at Talking Scared. You're in the middle of a Dark Tower deep dive right now on Talking Scared with Neil and with Chris Panettiere, who I met this past weekend at Ghoulish Book Fest, and we were talking about him being a Dark Tower newbie and not really being, and he's like, it's just an excuse for Nat and Neil to roast me. And I was like, no, keep going. He had the Wastelands at his table, so he's
okay. Good.
He's into book 3. I was as a longtime Dark Tower fan, I am very interested in that series, but I'm especially interested because you talked about how doing the deep dive on it informed some of the stuff you were playing with in When the Wolf Comes Home.
Yeah.
Without stealing Neil's thunder, I don't want to steal stuff from Talking Scared, but I'm curious, what has going back to the Dark Tower in this sort of intensive way done for you as like a fan and a writer so far?
Oh, that's such a great question. Obviously, yes, I have also started like figuring out what my version of an epic like multi-volume story would be. So like that has started to like cook a little bit. So I'm like, oh, what would, many of my books tend to like almost function as like responses to Stephen King books. So I'm like, what would my version of the Dark Tower be? So maybe one day I'll get to actually write that, because I've got a fun idea that I kind of want to tease out, but I have too many other books I want to write first. But mostly I think one of the, like, anyone who's listened to that deep dive already, what has come out of it so far, will know that this is how I feel about it. But like, one of the true joys of revisiting the Dark Tower for me, which I've done many, many times now, is that I love that feeling of witnessing something being built in the moment. And Stephen King, going back to our plotter and pantser great debate once more, he kind of famously is always looked at as like someone who doesn't plot. He doesn't plan. He just like sits down and writes. And I think that leads people to believe that, like, his first draft is the draft that is published. Like, it just means that the first draft is his outline. Like, he's still going back and fixing things and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's like, it kind of becomes a meaningless distinction after a certain point. But that is only book by book. With the Dark Tower, you really do see how someone who doesn't plan writes a big epic like that, because there are so many like little inconsistencies or little like continuity errors that then, as he is kind of filling in the world and the blank spots of the world, he has to figure out a way to address these certain things. And it becomes this really interesting sort of macro view into this one writer's process that I find just so thrilling. Little things like one character says he's from a neighborhood in New York that is actually kind of incorrect. And that maybe copy that should have caught, but they didn't. And like, so that becomes an actual plot point, like a few books later. Like little things like that. Or, especially in the final 3 that were kind of written in that great burst of inspiration after his accident. and you can just see him like pulling all these ingredients of things that maybe he didn't even intend to bring up or to use again. Characters from other from other not marginal, what is the peripheral books, and things like that, like just kind of pulling them in. There's like this madcap manic glee to it that I find very addictive and inspiring, of just like this, you have like the Tolkien and the George R.R. Martin and Brandon Sanderson kind of school of epic world building, which feels very thorough and feels very bulletproof. And then you have this that is just kind of slapdash and like, hey, wouldn't it be fun if this happens? Like, what if he winds up on a beach and there are lobsters that can chop your hands off? Like, okay, fine. Like, why not? Like, I love that. Like, there's something about that kind of reminds you that the joy of storytelling is whatever is in front of the reader, whatever they are picking up with their flashlight in this dark hallway of story. And sometimes you don't have to fully understand the labyrinth in which they are in to know every corner and turn. Like, just keep whatever's in front of them interesting and compelling. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's even more than enough. Sometimes that is like the true delight of it, to like discover that with them. So every time I reread The Dark Tower, like I kind of am reminded of that feeling.
Yeah. I'm due for a reread at some point. I think this deep dive that y'all are doing is going to be the thing that gets me to go back finally. It's been too long. In a little over a month, as we're talking, we're recording this on March 18th. In a little over a month, you have a book out. So before we let you go, will you let people know where to find you online and what you have coming up?
Thank you. Yes, everyone should pre-order When the Wolf Comes Home, which comes out April 22nd, 2025. And that can be pre-ordered anywhere you get your books, your ebooks, your audiobooks, your trade books, wherever you want to buy multiple copies. Do what I do with a new book and buy the e-copy, trade copy, and audio, because it's a sickness that you should indulge in. But I should also say the audiobook is fucking fantastic. I have been spoiled rotten with great audiobooks, and this one is no different. The narrator, Helen Laser, does an exquisite job. And there are a few like little production touches and stuff like that that are really, really fun. So at least get one hard copy and one audio copy. That'll be our pact. Okay. And that can be done wherever you get your books. Obviously, indie books, indie bookstores, maybe you should give a little more love to than the giant behemoth. But you can find me pretty much anywhere. I'm on all of the social media. I don't check Twitter anymore. That place is dead to me. But everywhere else, I'm a bit of a post and ghoster, but occasionally I spend a little more time and respond and stuff like that. So you can find me at all of them: TikTok, Blue Sky, Threads, under my name. Instagram, I'm Cat Cassidy, because somebody took Nat Cassidy before I could get to it. But you can find me. And then beyond that, I've got, speaking of Stephen King, I've got a story in the Stand anthology that is like this landmark, incredible anthology that I am honored beyond honored to be in. And that comes out in August. And then that's all I kind of know at the moment. I gotta finish this fucking book. That's what I gotta do. I gotta finish this new one. I'm like 2 months late.
Whenever you finish it, we will be ready to read it. Our guest has been Nat Cassidy. Nat, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Matthew. Absolute pleasure. I'll see you on the next one.
Thanks once again to Nat Cassidy for being on the show. Be sure to check out When the Wolf Comes Home when it arrives on April 22nd. Also, go back and read Nat's other books, Rest Stop, Nestlings, and Mary, An Awakening of Terror. It's all great stuff. Love Nat's work. It was great to finally chat with him. Be sure to follow him on socials, and be sure to follow us on socials. We are at scaresshapedus.bsky.social on Blue Sky. We are The Scares That Shaped Us on Facebook. We are also The Scares That Shaped Us on YouTube, if that's how you prefer to get your podcast. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, random thoughts that you want to send my way, you can email me at scaresthatshapeduspodcast@gmail.com. And that does it for us this week. We will be back next week with a brand new episode coming to you on Wednesday, April 2nd. Texas-based horror author, rising star, new friend of mine, LP Hernandez, is going to be here. We're going to talk about his books, including No Gods, Only Chaos and The Valley of the Headless Men, which are both amazing. You should pick those up. His work as a new publisher in the horror scene, and the legendary sci-fi horror film Event Horizon. It's a lot of fun. Hope you join us back here. Again, that's April 2nd at noon Central. That does it for me this week. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. I'm Matthew Jackson, and this is The Scares That Shaped Us.